From a superficial perspective, addiction may seem like merely a matter of willpower, a destructive behavior that a person should be able to control if they simply wanted to, with enough determination. But this way of seeing it is not only simplistic, it is profoundly mistaken. Carl Jung, one of the great explorers of the human soul, understood that behind every addiction there is an untold story, an existential void, an invisible fracture between who we are and who we long to be. Jung did not view addiction as a mere moral failing, but as a failed, yet deeply human, attempt to reach something sacred. To him, the addict was not someone weak or vicious, but someone who had lost contact with their inner center, with that vital force that gives direction and meaning to existence. In words often attributed to Jung, no addict heals unless they find a spiritual experience. This phrase brilliantly summarizes the idea that the core issue is not the substance, the behavior, or the dependency itself, but what that dependency represents inside the individual, a desperate search for a deeper connection to life. Often, the addict does not know what they are searching for. They only feel a constant anguish, a sense of incompleteness that they cannot explain with words. That anxiety drives them to seek relief, even if only momentary, in something external: alcohol, drugs, sex, gambling, food, technology. The substance or behavior becomes a symbolic substitute for what they truly crave, meaning inner unity, a significant relationship with something greater than themselves. But the relief they find is fleeting. It soothes for a few hours, maybe a few days, but then the original dissatisfaction returns with greater intensity. It is a cycle that repeats and deepens, because the more one tries to fill that void with something external, the further they drift from the real source of their suffering. For Jung, this dynamic is a sign that the soul is hungry for truth, for authenticity, for wholeness. Addiction, then, is a silent cry from the unconscious, calling out for meaning. In many ancient cultures, the use of psychoactive substances was reserved for sacred rituals, not as a means to escape reality, but to enter into a deeper connection with the universe, with the gods, with the eternal. Today, in a society disconnected from the symbolic and the spiritual, those same substances are consumed without restraint or purpose, as if the individual were unconsciously trying to recreate an experience of transcendence that has been denied to them. The problem is that without a symbolic structure, without inner guidance, that search becomes a fall. The substance no longer leads to the expansion of the soul, but to its fragmentation. Jung believed that human beings cannot live by reason alone. They need myths, they need images, they need symbols that give shape to their inner world. When these symbols disappear or become hollow, the soul begins to deteriorate. And when the soul is sick, it seeks healing in whatever way it can. Addiction, in this sense, is a clumsy but legitimate way of seeking a remedy for that invisible pain. That is why Jung was so influential in the early days of programs like Alcoholics Anonymous. Bill Wilson, its founder, was inspired by a letter from Jung, in which the psychologist explained that the only true antidote to addiction was a spiritual transformation. It wasn't about imposing willpower or following strict rules, but about allowing something new to be born within the individual, something that would give meaning to their existence, something that would reconnect them with their lost center. From this perspective, addiction is not simply a habit to correct, it is a sign. It is the symptom of a crisis of the soul, And like every crisis, it also contains an opportunity, the possibility of going beyond the surface, of looking inward, of beginning a journey of self-discovery. Jung did not speak of curing the addict in the traditional medical sense, but of helping them find what they had been searching for in the wrong place. Their task was not just to give up a substance, but to rediscover themselves. The suffering of the addict, as painful as it is, reveals something fundamental, that within them there still exists a vital energy that is searching for something true, that there is still a heartbeat of hope for transcendence, even if it is covered by layers of fear, confusion, and guilt. That hope is what makes transformation possible. It is not punishment that changes a person, but meaning. And meaning only arises when one hits rock bottom and begins to see life from another depth. Many addicts describe a sensation of emptiness they cannot name. It is as if something is missing, even if they can't say what. Jung understood that this something is the totality of the psyche, the integration of all the parts that have been rejected, forgotten, or repressed. What the addict truly longs for is not the substance itself, but what it represents: comfort, power, belonging, love, redemption. Deep down, they are seeking to reconnect with an essential part of themselves that has been split off by pain or trauma. Here lies a central idea: addiction as a symbol. In Jung's universe, symptoms are not mere errors of the organism. They are messages, manifestations of the unconscious that seek to be heard. Addiction speaks a language that is not rational, but deeply meaningful. It tells us that something within us is out of balance, something that needs to be integrated, understood, accepted, not to justify destructive behavior, but to reveal its origin and from there open the path toward real transformation. This way of seeing the addict is neither condescending nor idealistic. It is radically human, because it recognizes that behind the pain there is a story, behind the habit a symbol, and behind the symbol a possibility for change. Jung reminds us that what hurts us the most may also be what teaches us the most, if we know how to listen with an open heart. Addiction, then, is not only a trap, it is also a misdirected compass. Yes, it is distorted, but not useless, because it points to an unresolved need for wholeness, a thirst for meaning that has not been quenched, a search that, rather than being ignored or repressed, must be understood and channeled. Only when a person discovers what they truly long for can they free themselves from what enslaves them. When someone seeks a feeling of relief through addiction, they rarely do so consciously. They don't sit down to analyze their deeper motivations or clearly understand what drives them to repeat behaviors they themselves recognize as destructive. There is a part of their being that seems to act on its own, that takes over their decisions and drags them to the same dark place again and again. That part, dwelling in the depths of the unconscious, is what Jung called the shadow. The shadow is not an evil entity. It is the sum of everything the individual has repressed throughout their life. It includes impulses, emotions, memories, and desires that do not fit the image the person wants to have of themselves. It is everything that has been rejected in order to adapt, to be accepted, or to emotionally survive. But what is repressed does not disappear. It merely changes form. And when it is not consciously integrated, it seeks alternative outlets. One of those outlets may be addiction. At its core, addiction is the symptom of an inner struggle. On one side is the part that seeks control, success, acceptance, recognition. On the other is that hidden region that carries unexpressed pain, repressed rage, denied sadness. Instead of confronting that conflict, the addict tries to silence it. The problem is, everything repressed returns, and with more strength. The shadow does not settle for being ignored. It shows up in moments of weakness, in impulsive decisions, in behaviors that seem to go against one's own best interest. What complicates this dynamic even more is that the person often doesn't realize they are fighting themselves. They think the enemy is outside, the substance, the temptation, the environment. But in reality, the true battle is being fought within. One part of them wants to release the buried pain, while another part suffocates it, judges it, hides it. This internal conflict generates a constant tension, an anxiety that seems to have no clear origin but slowly wears them down. Many addicts, even after trying to quit the substance, feel empty, irritable, or depressed. They don't understand why they still feel bad if they've already eliminated the habit. The reason is that the root of the problem is not in the substance, but in what it helped silence. As long as the shadow remains hidden, it will continue to generate symptoms. And even if the form of the addiction changes, from alcohol to work, from sex to food, from drugs to social media, the pattern will keep repeating. Integrating the shadow is not an easy or quick process. It requires courage, honesty, and a deep desire to understand oneself. It is to look in the mirror without filters, to accept parts of oneself that have been despised or feared. It is to stop blaming the outside world and begin to explore what truly resides within. When someone begins this path, they stop seeing their addiction as an enemy and begin to see it as a messenger, a symbol that something needs attention, understanding, and transformation. This perspective does not exempt the individual from responsibility. It is not about justifying the harm that addiction can cause, but about understanding its origin in order to cut it at the root. When the shadow is faced with awareness, one no longer becomes its victim. On the contrary, a more honest relationship with oneself begins, in which impulses no longer have the power to dominate without resistance. In many cases, addiction is tied to past experiences that were not properly processed. Situations of abuse, abandonment, humiliation, or emotional deprivation may remain buried in the unconscious, generating a latent pain that seeks to be alleviated by any means. The shadow holds those memories, and even if the person has forgotten them on the surface, they continue to influence behavior. Repeated consumption becomes an unconscious way of avoiding reunion with that old pain. However, the more one tries to escape that reunion, the stronger the repressed becomes. The shadow begins to project itself onto the outside world. The addict starts to see enemies where there are none, to distrust relationships, to feel trapped in an environment perceived as hostile or indifferent. And in that distorted perception, the cycle intensifies. The more what one refuses to see inside is projected outward, the further one gets from the possibility of healing. There is a deeply spiritual dimension to this process, because facing the shadow is not just a psychological matter, it is an act of surrender and openness to a deeper truth. It is recognizing that within us dwell both light and darkness, and that both are necessary to achieve true wholeness. Addiction stops being seen as a sentence when one understands that its existence is an invitation to know oneself on a more intimate level. That knowledge cannot come from the outside, No formula, advice, or technique can substitute for inner work. Transformation happens when one stops avoiding the darkness and begins to walk within it, with humility and attention, not to remain there, but to understand what that darkness has to reveal. The shadow is not an obstacle to eliminate, but a territory to explore. Jung believed that the gold is in the shadow, meaning that the repressed aspects not only contain pain, but also potential. There lie the authentic emotions, the denied creativity, the hidden sensitivity, the forgotten power. Integrating the shadow means rescuing those essential parts of the self that were banished and now demand to be heard. The addict no longer sees themselves as someone broken and begins to recognize themselves as someone on a profound journey of transformation. The wound they carry is no longer just a source of shame, but a doorway to self-knowledge. The path is not linear nor free of setbacks, but it becomes more meaningful when walked with awareness and compassion. A person learns to read what that hidden need was truly about, and in that reading, a new way of being in the world begins to emerge. Jung observed that many times, people who were suffering deeply didn't need explanations, but rather a symbolic experience that could reorder their vision of life, something that allowed them to reconcile with their own story and find a new center within themselves. This reconciliation happens when the person feels part of something greater than themselves, not necessarily through institutional religion, but through a genuine spiritual experience. This spiritual dimension is not optional. It is a deep need of the human soul. Jung saw this clearly in his clinical practice. Those who failed to connect with a sense of the sacred were condemned to repeat their symptoms, as they couldn't find a purpose powerful enough to justify their transformation. The addictive impulse, in many cases, is a distorted way of seeking that transcendent experience. It is a need to dissolve the ego, to escape fragmentation, to feel unity. The tragedy is that by seeking this through substances, the result is the opposite: greater disconnection and disintegration. For transformation to be real, the individual must find a symbol that acts as the organizing center of their inner life. It may be an image, a vision, a dream, or an emotional experience that reveals a deeper meaning. That symbol isn't imposed from the outside. It emerges from the depths of the soul when pain has been sufficiently recognized and embraced. It's as if the psyche, upon feeling truly heard, finally reveals the map it has been waiting to show. Healing begins to take shape when that map stops being a set of broken paths and becomes a journey with direction. Rituals, myths, and archetypal stories have existed in all cultures because they serve a vital function. They help human beings navigate their crises, to symbolically die to an old identity and be reborn into a new one. The addict, in this sense, doesn't just need to stop using, they need to die to the image they held of themselves and build a new one. And that symbolic death isn't achieved through willpower, but through a deep surrender to the inner process. When that surrender happens, symbols begin to speak. Fire stops being only destruction and becomes purification. Darkness ceases to be just a threat and becomes a fertile space where truth begins to germinate. What once seemed unbearable transforms into possibility. Therapeutic or spiritual support can facilitate this process, but it cannot substitute it. No external guide can force the symbolic to appear. It can only prepare the ground for it to emerge. The true alchemy happens in the invisible, when the soul of the individual decides to stop running and begins to listen. In that moment, what once seemed like a story of failure becomes a heroic narrative. The pain doesn't disappear, but it shifts. It's no longer an obstacle, but a teacher, no longer a weight, but a sign. Suffering, then, is no longer something to be eliminated. It becomes something to be integrated. Addiction, understood from this perspective, is not merely a disease. It is a failed attempt at transformation, a desperate search for meaning that has taken a wrong path. But the error does not invalidate the search. On the contrary, it makes it deeper, because only those who have hit rock bottom know what is truly urgent. Only those who have felt everything collapse can rebuild themselves with authenticity. And in that rebuilding, the symbol acts as a seed that is not imposed, not forced, but when it finds fertile ground, grows with unstoppable strength. As that seed grows, it brings about change, not just in behavior, but in the very way of seeing the world. The person no longer identifies with their wounds, but begins to recognize themselves in their capacity to transcend them. They no longer seek anesthesia, but presence. They no longer wish to disappear, but to participate actively in their own destiny. And that participation transforms everything, because what was once experienced as suffering is now understood as initiation. The addict ceases to be a passive subject trapped in a cycle and becomes the protagonist of a profound journey toward wholeness. It is in that journey where pain becomes wisdom, where the shadow becomes an ally, and where the symbolic opens the door to a spirituality that is lived, not theorized. A spirituality that does not deny the body, that does not escape the world, but inhabits it more deeply. Healing, then, is not a return to a previous state. It is the emergence of something new, something that didn't exist before and could only be born because the soul passed through the abyss. The symbol is not an intellectual ornament. It is the key to opening a broader reality, a reality in which the human being, in understanding themselves, reconciles with their story, with their pain, and ultimately with their own possibility of freedom. When the symbol has taken root, life begins to reorder itself around a new understanding. It's no longer about controlling life or avoiding pain, but about learning to inhabit it with awareness. The emptiness that once felt unbearable reveals its true face. It was not absence, it was space, a space where something real could grow. Addiction, with all its darkness, becomes the imperfect language of a soul that longed to be heard. And when that listening becomes deep, authentic, and free of judgment, the need to escape fades. The journey toward wholeness does not demand perfection. It asks for honesty, the ability to look within and not turn away. Healing is not about forgetting what was lived, but about understanding that even in suffering, there was a seed of truth. Carl Jung didn't offer simple answers. He offered paths so that each person could find their own. Because at its core, every addiction is a plea for meaning, and every healing is a reconciliation with the mystery of being alive. Right there, at the exact point where pain no longer needs explanation, true freedom begins.